Okay. And then, so sometimes I can get a little carried away with words. And so please let me know if there's something I should explain a little bit in more context. Um, so we're just going to dive in and, all right. So when we get started with the district, there's a lot of data that we have to get together. We collect that data, we analyze that data, we reach out and we speak to the boroughs and the townships, and we get additional data on like residential development. We then start to look at the trends that's happening in the area, do some analytical processes, and then by the time we're done, we're able to put all of this together in a forecast, into a forecast. This lovely diagram is an overview of our methodology, and essentially it just shows you the pieces of data that we're working with, how it correlates or connects into the next component, what it influences. And what I do really like to point out on this slide is that the biggest box on here is your student data. Everything that we do is very spatially driven, but it's also very much focused around your district, right? The births that are happening in your area, your 4 years of student data. So it's very, very localized and focused. All right, so going back to what I was saying earlier, we do everything very spatially. So we have this saying called think spatially. And so what that means is starting to think about the relationship of things within your district. And so where do students live? Where are the boundaries of your attendance areas? Where's the development and relationship to those things? And that comes into just the way we collect the data and the way we present it. So when you see in as we go from left to right, we take those 4 years of student data that we get from the district, and we go through a process called geocoding. And essentially what that does is it puts those kiddos on a map based on where they live. And once we get that done, we go through the process of digitizing the attendance areas so that they're also on the map. And that's, you can see that next image over, we locate the facilities. We make sure that those are shown and all of their information is available. And then we take those attendance boundaries and we do a process where we're cutting apart something we call study areas. And essentially these study areas, as you can see down here, these study areas are bite-sized pieces of your community, right? We look at subdivisions, we cut along natural boundaries. If there's a major highway, we want to cut along that. So we create these small communities, these small subdivisions of areas that allows us to apply those factors at a really focused level. And so that whenever we get to the point where we're ready to run the forecast, that forecast is actually being run on each of these study areas individually, and then it kind of sums it all up at the end. The next thing we really do a heavy emphasis on is your residential development. As I mentioned, we contact the boroughs and we talk to people at the townships, and we speak with the district, and we all sorts of online research, as well as like reading city minutes and stuff like that. So there's a lot of information and a lot of digging into this that we do. And I'll go into a lot more detail about that here in a minute. And then, by the time we capture all of these individualized pieces of data, then we're able to do something more along the lines of spatial analytics, right? So rather than running a formula in, let's say, a spreadsheet, this way we can do the spatial analytics that allows us to compare and contrast this data, all of this data that we brought together, because all this data also has information behind it, right? So in the image that you'll on the right-hand side, that's a map that you'll see here in a second, but it shows like historical net change that we were able to capture based on that historical student data. All right, so as I mentioned, we get those kiddos geocoded. They're on the map, and then we're able to create a density map. So it's similar to your weather maps where you've got the more intense color of yellow, shows the denser student population. And then the further out that student population becomes, the less dense, you kind of get that gradient out to a light blue. And even if there's an area that doesn't look like it's shaded, it doesn't mean there's not a student there. There's just one, so it doesn't really pick up on that intensity. And as you can see, you really do have higher concentrations in the evergreen area as well as down here almost equidistant between Cleveland, Stewart, and Ramsey. And then again, Ramsey also has a pretty significant hotspot as well. All right, and then so the first thing that we really start to do once we get all the data gathered, we go through this QA/QC process. We're communicating with the district. We're taking the data that they've provided to us and the student data, and we're just making sure that everything is accurate and clean, no duplicates, no missing information that we need, and then we kind of like reproduce it back to them. And so we put these different historical student analysis charts together, so that going into this, we kind of have this idea, this kind of similar concept of what we can expect, and before we even get started, right? And so at the very top chart, there's this historical 4 years of data to the current year that says, you know, how are these schools, these facilities been shifting over time? And then the bottom chart looks at that same thing, but by grade. And so you can kind of start to get this feeling of which grades have consistently been growing or maintaining. Same thing with the facilities. So for example, you can see the Gateway High School has had this slightly upward trend over the past few years. So for example, over the between last year and this year, looking at the fall October snapshot dates is what this data is focused on. You know, they gained, that facility gained 30 students from one year to the next. And this map to the right allows us to spatially see where those changes were taking place in these study areas that I'll tell you about. So in y'all's area, historically speaking, has been fairly stable. If it's gray, there's been no change. And if it's in the orange shade, then basically it's 1 to 7 students lost, not significant. And then if it's green, you've gained up to 12 in that particular study area. So again, pretty stable historically speaking. And then the next set of spatial analytics that we start to do is comparing the students of where they go to school, what schools are they transferring to based on where they live, and we put something together called an attendance matrices. And I'm going to read this to you left to right so that it kind of makes a little sense, because it's a lot of information on this table. And so, for example, Cleveland Elementary School, the facilities that are on the left-hand side, the left column, think of those as school of residence. So not the school point itself, but the geographical area that attendance area is. And so if you're looking at K4, in that attendance area, there are 303 students, K4, that live in that attendance area. Of those 303, 287 of them actually attend Cleveland Stewart. And then you have 5 that choose to go to Evergreen, 8 to Ramsey, and so forth. Now, if you look down, top to bottom, now the schools across the top are the actual facility. So at that space, we're looking at school of enrollment. And so similarly, we can go down, we can say Cleveland Stewart, we have those 287, but we're getting 0 coming from the Evergreen attendance area, 1 is coming from Ramsey, and so forth. By the time we get to the bottom, you've got your total resident students, your interdistrict transfer 1, and I'll explain that here in a second, and then your pre-K kiddos at Cleveland is 0. All of your pre-K kiddos are over there at University Park. These interdistrict transfers, these are specifically students that either A, they did not geocode for one reason or another, maybe there was something that didn't quite mesh with the address, or in most instances, these were kiddos that actually live outside your district at the time, but they since have moved into your district. So, so they are now actually resident students, but at the October snapshot, this was their data. And then that brings us back to the full total of the enrollment at that facility. This correlates to the earlier data verification that we received at the very beginning, so that we make sure that every student has been accounted for. And it does the same thing through your middle school as well and your high school. Alrighty, so once we have that, we can kind of start to get this idea of utilization, transfer, and analysis. And considering the fact that there's really not any out-of-district transfers, right? You have all of your students live inside your town boundaries. The main focus to have here is your a capacity, your enrollment utilization. And so Cleveland Elementary School, K4, we're looking at a capacity of 335. This is often a functional capacity based on how the space is being used at the time. And, you know, if we have those 292 students that are enrolled, you're looking at about 87.2% utilization. For that particular facility. If we were to look at Ramsey, right now you're operating at about 100%, as well as like University Park, about 93%. All right, so after we get the data established, right, spatially based, then there are several variables that we have to look at that can also influence that forecast. Births being one of those, right? Because kindergarten births in the area will later go on to influence that kindergarten cohort. There are a few things that I do want to point out on here. There is your district. It's interesting. It does have a tendency when it comes to the births to do a very like up and down effect. So in one year, you've got 327, a few years later. So it maintained really well for a while. But then when you hit about 2018, you had this pretty big dip going from 340 to 305. And then you went back up to 346, and then you're back down to 306. And so you kind of have this, you know, up and down effect that's going to happen. And you're going to kind of see that trickle in through your kindergarten cohort. And then that upward down effect kind of matriculates down into later grades. All righty. And then so what that does is that allows us to compare everything to this base year. So we start to identify what are the changes that we can anticipate happening based on this base year. So you've got this, like with next year, there are 306 kiddos that were born in 2020. And so we anticipate that they're going to be kindergartners in 2025. That's about an 88% change from this year. And when we look historically speaking, y'all for the most part have been fairly stable when it comes to that resident capture based on the number of students that are born. So you were at about a 72% here, and then you were at a 74%, and then you have this 81%. And you might be like, why is there this crazy number up there? Basically what happened is during the pandemic, a lot of parents had that choice of keeping their kids at home. And so those students that would have been kindergartners in 2020, they opted to not go to school that year, but then they became kindergartners the following year, right? So that means that you recaptured those students. So you ended up with a bubble in your kindergarten cohort for 2021. And it does look like there was a slight anomaly in the 2022, where you did capture a little bit less students than you typically do. But then you like rebounded right back up in 2019 or 2024. And then we anticipate that to fairly remain stable the next few years. And so working under the expectation and that trend going into the forecast, we anticipate that 77% capture rate to be carried on. So this chart basically depicts the same thing we were just looking at the other way, just visualizing it in a different perspective. And so you can kind of see that big dip to 64%. You also see where the births that year were 340, and just how that anticipated forecasts measure up with what you've historically been seeing. It's just another way just to visualize that data. And then we end up with something called mobility factors. Mobility factors are specifically driven by your historical student data. So it takes the 4 years that the 4 years of students that we geocoded, and it analyzes it and identifies the number of students in that cohort as they go from year to year. And so let me explain that a little bit better. So for example, Cleveland Elementary School, again, we're thinking spatially, right? So we're thinking attendance area. So in that attendance area, you've got all sorts of kiddos at all grades that live in that attendance area. So we do it at the smaller level, the calculations. And so Cleveland Elementary School, as that kindergarten cohort goes from kindergarten into first grade, what's happening, right? Are you losing students? Are you gaining students? Or are they maintaining? In this particular case, as that same cohort goes from kindergarten to first, historically speaking, over 4 years, the trend is they typically lose 5%. So what does that mean? It means like if you had theoretically 100 students that are kindergartners, then by the time they became first graders, you lost 5 students. Okay. And so you can kind of look at this chart throughout the entire thing from year to year. So same cohort, first grade to second grade, and a point, so 98%. And then as you go from second grade to third grade, you're gaining a 2%, that kind of thing. The interesting thing that I do want to, there's 2 interesting things that I want to point, actually I want to say 3, that I'd like to highlight on this particular table. When we look at this 8 to 9, this tells me that there is a private or charter school in your area that ends at 8th grade. And therefore, you are recapturing those students when they leave that school and they re-enroll back in your your facilities. And then this also right here, the 11th to 12th grade. I also want to point out that's really good rates. It is not really, really good retention rates is what I want to say. It's not unusual for me to see some drops and declines in those numbers. And so that's just one of you see that that's really good rates. As well as University Park has a tendency to really maintain stable across. You've got this very stable, slight growth that's happening across that entire geographical attendance area for University Park. Otherwise, when I look at this chart, I see very, very stable numbers. You have pockets of growth, very few pockets of small drops. And then you've got one that has just maintained the same, historically speaking. And so a pretty stable mobility. Alrighty, so as mobility was looking at historical housing, so housing that you have, the next thing we have to look at is what can we anticipate to come from that residential development that you have coming. And so we then take this geocoded students, we look at where they live, what are the housing that they live in, and we start to calculate something we call the student yield factor. And with this, it allows us to identify historically what's happened, and we can apply that with what we expect to happen into the forecast. So, for example, in single family detached housing, PK through 12, the rate was a 0.0339. So what this means is for every 100 new residential single-family detached units, we can anticipate having about 34 students, and that is PK through 12 students, so 34 students. And they're not going to all show up at once. They're basically, as that development becomes, year to year, it's built, they're occupied. So those students will start to slowly appear until that development's done and stabilizes. And then this is a map of your residential development. You can kind of see, you can see that most of it is in the Evergreen, Evergreen area. And you have a combination of inactive as well as planned and it looks like 2 active. Inactive basically means we're monitoring it. Something may have, it was being built or maybe it was being pursued and then it's kind of stopped for a little bit. And so it doesn't have anything in the forecast, but we do keep an eye on it in case that were to change down the line. And then there's a little bit of development in Evergreen and then University Park. And then we have on the next slide, this lets you know this is a table, this table associates to that previous map. And you can identify the map ID. It lets you locate that on that previous map. And so you can kind of start to see the projects, the type of housing that it is, total units that are supposed to come from that housing, and then what was applied in the forecast. Sometimes this number will change because maybe that development was already really active and maybe half of it's already built. And then we itemize this, we estimate the students that should come from that development, and then when we anticipate it being fully occupied. And in this particular case, you have 333 units that are included in the forecast. Then you have 462 units that are in the future. So that university apartment that's happening, there's not enough information yet for us to put that in the forecast, but it will most likely happen sometime within the next 10 years. But when it does happen, with that student yield factor of 0.07 for the apartments, it will probably yield about 30 PK through 12 students. Alrighty, so we've gone through, we've looked at the different variables, we've gathered all the data. Gotta get a drink. All right, so we've gathered all that data, and then we've started running the forecast. So this is, I know it's a lot of color. Basically, what this means is the deeper the red, the lower the number, the higher the number, the darker the green. Okay, so right away you're able to start picking up these trends. What are some things that are happening? We don't colorize PK/TK because that's not really influential when it comes to kindergarten. But you start to pick up on some of those trends and those things that I was mentioning earlier, like that big dip you had in 2022 that was going to influence that kindergarten cohort as it went through. And so that's why you have this deeper red here. You have another one here. So several years back, you probably had another dip in kindergarten cohort, and it's just slowly trickling its way back through. You've got that positive mobility that's allowing it to just like slowly gain that value over time. So you see that mobility. This is where you kind of see it going from year to year, that kindergarten, first grade to second grade cohort. And that's what's being applied. And so this year you had 267 kindergartners. As that mobility, as they matriculate through, you're just going to slowly see that cohort grow. And then it's anticipated that, should all these trends continue, by the time that cohort hits, 10th grade, they might be about 340 students in that cohort. And then when you look down, this is as you go from year to year, that's where your residential development influences, right? So the number of units that we anticipate to come online in 2025 and come online, as well as being occupied, you'll see that change. That's where it happens year to year. All right, and then we start to add things back together by cohort, or by grade configuration. So looking at this, we're about we started off with 3,426, and then looking at that resident student, we're growing just a little bit. And overall, you do have this very slight upward trend of growth, but for the most part, a pretty reasonably stable district. This takes that same chart from before, so let me go backwards really quick. So this same bottom 4 rows, that's the same what you have right here. So we're now kind of taking those students and bringing them back together. So remember, we started this off in October, snapshot date. So there were a few students that at the time technically lived outside the district, even though they're in the district now. So we start to bring all of those numbers back together to make sure that by the time we get down here, every student is accounted for. And so if we were to start to look at this annual net change, you can see those trends go up and down, a lot of it due to the births. So those birth influencers. And then so like next year, probably a growth of about 20 kiddos. And then the year after that, you've got 43. Some of that is driven by that development, as well as those larger growth kindergarten cohorts. But then as we taper off towards the back end, it feels like there's this dip. It's really very insignificant, but a lot of that is because the development that we have at this point has completed. So I often tell my districts, focus on the first 3 to 5 years, because that is where we have really, really solid information, right? We know the kiddos that have been born. We know that residential development that's on, being planned and is being built. But, as we've all learned, that sometimes there's other things that can influence a forecast, or, influence our economy, and things get built faster or things get built slower. Maybe Amazon moves in next door, and, you just have all this burst of residential development. So, but, if all of these trends did continue, this is what we can expect. This is just another like sideways view to look at your forecast. And so again, you can kind of see that trend where it's just a slight uptick year after year, and then you just kind of stable off. Like you just, it's just a very level, very modest growth, and pretty healthy. And then this map shows you where that change could be happening over the next 5 years. So we're looking at just 5 years. And the darker green means that those are areas or the study years that we're talking about that you were likely to see some of those neighborhood turnover. So students are graduating, younger families haven't quite moved in yet. And so you'll see that student loss in those areas. But then like the lighter green is loss, but not as many. But when I say loss, it's like up to 21 kiddos in that space. So it's again, not very significant. And then you have the gray is no change. And then the areas that are orange and then the red shows you where you can anticipate those students to be growing. So you've got that neighborhood turnover. You have the students that are, or the families that are moving into those neighborhoods, as well as any of the influences from the residential development that's occurring. So in summary, we started off this year in October with about 3,400 students. Anticipate, so let's say 3,426. And then in about 5 years, you can anticipate to be about 3,574-ish, right? So it's about a 4% growth. So in summary, anticipating at about a 4% growth over the next 5 years. Your resident student population is rising. So the students, you've got more people moving into your district at a nice little pace. Long term, you've got larger graduating cohorts that are kind of being replaced by some smaller ones. So if we were to look further out, like those last 4 years, what we're looking at where you start to see that those little minus numbers, that's because some of those larger cohorts are graduating out. Your mobility indicates high retention and some moderate growth when it comes to Evergreen Elementary School attendance area. And then your birth rates, they do routinely fluctuate. However, your district market share tends to remain stable. And then let's see. And that concludes the overall presentation.